A magnifying glass. That is how I often describe liturgical seasons, that the church gives us these seasons, this time, so that we might magnify a particular mystery of faith, which we celebrate in a very real way during that time, for example, in this time of Advent, but are really part of our everyday lives as a Christian. And while we celebrate Emmanuel, God with us, the coming of Christ at the end of time and in our daily lives in a very real way in Advent, we know that day in and day out, we are to be ready and prepared. And that certainly there might be seasons in our own lives, years, that might seem like we are preparing very specifically for Jesus to return again in glory. A magnifying glass. We are given this time so we can focus our attention on something very specific that will help us to prepare the way for the Lord. As I mentioned on the first Sunday in Advent, that we have this great mystery that in this time we actually move backwards in time. So this threshold feast of Christ the King leads us to the first Sunday of Advent, when again we know that the Lord will come like a thief in the night, echoed in our second reading today from the second letter of St. Peter. A day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like a day, but still we know we need to be ready. And as we then move backward in time, here John the Baptist is a full-grown man. We start at the very beginning of Mark's gospel this evening. Mark begins his gospel not with the birth of Jesus, but rather his public ministry. And we hear John the Baptist, familiar with the prophet Isaiah, proclaiming, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths." And then as these days of Advent unfold, we will move back in time with Mary and Elizabeth, still heavy with child, and then very close to the time of Christmas, we will then celebrate Jesus' birth in time. O come, Emmanuel, God is with us. In antiquity, and it's still this way today in some measure, when an important person was traveling from point A to point B, especially the roads were rugged, they needed to make sure that it was safe. They had to prepare the way for the Lord. So scouts would go out, say between Jerusalem and the Sea of Galilee. The road took them along the Jordan River, and they needed to make sure that this important person would be able to pass safely. Towns were typically set apart for a day's journey. We know that certainly it was difficult to travel by wagon. Maybe they used horses or simply just walked. And in preparation to arrive at the place where they were heading, someone needed to go and make sure that their way was straight, that the rugged plain was made smooth. So the message that Mark proclaims in the gospel would not be that unfamiliar to people. They were used to having this kind of caste system where there were very important people that had lots of money and resources, and all the rest were very poor. These villages were small, so when this important person came through and said, "Prepare the way of the Lord," they would have listened. They would have gotten out of their houses and their huts, and they would have seen who was coming. And that's the context of this gospel passage today. So we know that's this very bold and beautiful proclamation. Prepare the way of the Lord, a voice of one crying out into the desert, make straight his path, has a very historical and real significance. But for us who have this magnifying glass on how we prepare the way of the Lord in our own lives, celebrating tomorrow night's the sacrament of reconciliation might be the perfect thing that you or I need. How do we sort of take what's rugged and rocky, or perhaps even thorny, and smooth it out so that the Lord might be revealed in us in a new way? Perhaps the preparation that we need to make is that of trying to find some more stillness in our lives. This time of Advent happens in the coldest, darkest days of the year, where we continue to move towards the winter solstice. And I know that I am longing for the earth to tilt back toward the sun. It's really hard to be awake, to be alert when it's always so dark outside. So what do we have to do to heighten our attentions away from sleepiness? What do we have to do in order to prepare for more patience in our lives? So when we're on the road driving, perhaps, we don't get all knotted up inside because someone's not doing what we think they ought. The kind of spiritual preparation that the church calls us to in this time of Advent is certainly very, very important. It's good for us to read those daily reflections or go online or find an app where we can really focus our attention on what the Lord might be asking us. This time of Advent, our scriptures during the weekend, on weekends, those prophetic voices from our ancient ancestors are so beautiful, and I encourage you to read them. There's so many things that we can do, focusing our attention, looking more closely like we have a magnifying glass in our hands to prepare for the comings of Christ at the end of time, in time, at Christmas, and in our time. How are we preparing the way for the Lord? A really good question for us to ask ourselves, to ponder, and then finally take some action so that our lives are different in the morning each day that we wake up closer to the celebration of the Nativity of Jesus Christ. John the Baptist is certainly a beautiful figure that we have been given, this cousin of Jesus, set apart for God's work in a special way. And we too in the waters of baptism have been set apart ourselves. And we know that we are not just baptized with water, as John the Baptist baptized, but with the Holy Spirit. So I ask you, I beg you, to ask the Holy Spirit today how you might for yourselves prepare the way for the Lord.